All right. Well, last time we ended off looking at meiosis, comparing that with mitosis. And if you can do that, that's probably something that would be several worthy questions on an exam. Now we're going to finish up this and kind of look at the life cycle. I'm mainly focused on the animal. I would be remiss if we didn't discuss just a little bit of what's going on when it comes to the plants. And in plants, when it comes to this perpetuation of the species, their life cycle, they are a little bit different. They have a couple different alternatives. They switch from one generation to the next. In one generation, you'll have a number of what's called gametophytes, where they are, and they can be larger or smaller. I don't really care about that. What I care about is what they are. And when plants enter into this gametophyte stage, just look at the word, okay? The word here is gamete, okay? And gametes are the sex cells, all right? And when you see sex cells, the egg and the sperm is what you should be thinking about, okay? And if that is what you are thinking about, then you know that these guys have half the material, okay? So that makes them haploid. And you see this a lot in mosses, fungus, various different plants in that regard. And honestly, if we were in lab a lot more, we would kind of delve into this maybe a little bit, just to kind of understand life cycles and where we actually get some of the great things that we can through genetic manipulation of some of these things, algae, to get a number of various different biotechnology products that we use in our daily lives. But since we don't have that, I'm really not going to dive into any more than that, really. There's also this thing called a sporophyte, and spores contain everything. Okay, contain everything. Okay, contain it all. And that means they are diploid. Okay. That means they are diploid. They contain it all. And you see this a lot. You actually see this in some of the animal species as well. In some of the kind of the first branches off of the evolutionary tree for when it comes to animals. Some of your cnidarians and whatnot, sponges, porifera, they have this life cycle where they have one generation that they produces all of just a gametophyte generation. And then those two will come together and give rise to a sporophyte generation. And so that it's just how their life cycle is. Different and unique. I'm more interested in us in this class being able to compare animals. So you should be able to kind of give me a little bit of understanding when it comes to how the cycle of life works in an animal. We made reference to this, hints at this at the beginning of this discussion, okay? Individuals, you and I, are diploid, okay? Individuals are diploid, okay? You and me, all right? And we produce haploid gametes. Mom and dad, half from mom, half from dad gets you, all right? The only haploid part that we have in our life cycle is the gametes, right? So it is important that meiosis goes, and meiosis goes perfectly. If meiosis screws up, we have a number of potential genetic outcomes. Some can be viable, some can not be viable. And by not be viable, I mean reproduce, not necessarily survive. Some don't survive. If there is such a screw up that we'll hint at here in a little bit, because we're assuming meiosis goes normal all the time, and it obviously doesn't. There are a number of genetic conditions where we have more than one or less than one of the genetic material, where it's missing half of it, or it has too much of the genetic material because meiosis didn't occur properly. And we'll see some of those non-disjunctions here in just a little bit. So we'll hint at some of those. But the gamete is always going to be haploid when it comes to animals. Okay, always going to be haploid. We have two types of gametogenesis. In gametogenesis, just break down the word gamete, right? And genesis is formation of. Formation of, okay? So we have two types of gametogenesis. We have two different sexes. Makes sense. We have spermatogenesis, which is making sperm. Excuse me. And we have oogenesis, which is making the oocyte, which is the egg. Male and female, respectively. When we look at it, we'll break them down just a little bit here. We won't dive into it too hard. But what do you get out of spermatogenesis? That would be something that you should probably know. Well, you get 4 sperms. So for every sperm that enters into meiosis, 4 are a result. For women, it's a hell of a lot different, okay? Only 1 becomes the mature egg. The rest get dissolved, form what are called polar bodies. What do polar bodies do? We don't really know 100%. They potentially do a lot of different things, but they're not exactly sure as to 100% what in the world they do. They provide some sustenance to the surviving, to the one egg that does become mature. And they potentially do some other things as well. But there's a lot of research as to figuring out just what in the world these things do. So it's kind of interesting. You're producing something that really, why? It doesn't really do anything. From a genetic standpoint, it's almost a waste. But it obviously does something. It's stayed in, it's been this way ever since we evolved. So for some reason it is there. We just don't know exactly why. And that's the cool thing about science. At least for me it is. Okay. Sperm and egg come together at fertilization, and that results in a zygote. Okay. Dad, mom, diploid structures. Okay. Producing haploid gametes. Okay. The egg and the sperm. And there's our zygote when they come together. And then obviously this thing will go through a number of divisions, but it's division of mitosis, okay? It's just cells dividing and dividing and dividing. This is just a clump of cells. It's not a sperm, it's not a testicle, it's not an ovary. It's just a cell, a clump of cells that divides and divides and divides and divides until obviously, well, bam. This is probably the most confusing part, at least, that something that comes from a meiosis type of formation, sex cells, and what they actually give rise to, the zygote, which becomes you, basically, right? all of that division that's occurring in utero inside mom is all mitosis. Okay. Now, if you have a Y chromosome, we get testosterone production, and then that is going to cause some masculinization of the prototype gonad, and they're going to slowly start to become testes and descend down from the abdomen into the scrotal sac. For women, if they don't have that Y chromosome, those protogonads stay there, and they give rise to the ovaries and all the other fun parts that are associated with a woman. Brains will develop differently as well. There's a masculinization that occurs within the male brain because of that testosterone that gets produced. So it starts to hardwire their brains slightly different than a female. So it's pretty interesting. But all of that division, is basically mitosis, except for the little bit of differentiation when it comes to the testicles or the ovaries. Okay. And women actually do produce eggs in utero. You produce several million of them, and then you stop. And then nothing really happens with a female until you reach sexual maturity, okay, or enter into sexual maturity, I guess I should say, where you start going into puberty. So here are some terms. I'm going to highlight a few things. And maybe you can give me a sequence, like it goes from a stem cell, spermatogonia in a male. This is male, right? Sperm. Excuse me. And then that spermatogonia undergoes spermatogenesis. It makes a primary spermatocyte. Primary means one. Okay, primary means one. Then goes to a secondary. Goes to these things called spermatids, and spermatids are non-differentiated sperm. They're not mature. Okay. What does that mean for a sperm not to be mature? They have excess cytoplasm around the head of them, around the neck, and a little bit of the tail. This makes sperm really slow to move. And if sperm is slow, the female reproductive tract has a number of booby traps inside of it to kill it. It's slightly acidic for one, so it'll destroy the sperm that way if it stays around too long. But if it's a slow swimmer, the female reproductive system will mount an immune response against the foreign invader. It is a sperm, and it'll kill it. So you want to have the spermatid undergo further maturity and give rise to 4 Mr. Sperms or Miss Sperms, whatever you want. Okay. So for spermatogenesis, it's spermatogonia, primary spermatocyte, secondary spermatocyte, spermatid, and the mature sperm. For females, it's just as simple. Okay. We go from an oogonia, which is the stem cell. Oh my God, see how easy this is? To a primary to a secondary, secondary to the mature egg. For women, that's what you guys ovulate every month of your cycle. On the 14th day of your cycle, typically, that's that mature egg that you spit out of your ovary, and that's one that becomes or doesn't become fertilized. Okay. You produce a number of primary spermatocytes, and you pause. And then it really doesn't kick in again until about age 11 or 12, whenever you reach puberty. Once that happens, that that primary primary oocyte will finish up that division, enter into what's called metaphase 2, right? And then it will stop. It gets released, okay, ovulated. And then, only then, if a sperm comes and fertilizes it, they're in that fallopian tube, will it finish up metaphase 2. So for a woman, it's fascinating. You have millions of them in utero, and then by the time you reach puberty, you only have maybe 500 or so. And then of those 500, you only ovulate maybe 100 or so. So you whittle them down, and it's a normal process that occurs. So when it comes to female gamete formation, it is a hell of a lot more complex than a guy. All a guy has to do is have testosterone, and he's going to make sperm. So as long as he has a significant amount of testosterone production, he's going to have viable sperm production. Obviously, that diminishes, once you get into your 40s, testosterone production starts to diminish a little bit, and every decade of life, it becomes less and less and less. So, so you're not going to be producing, enough viable swimmers, but, it only takes one, right? And plus, do you want to be, 50 years old and having a kid, or 60 years old and having a kid? Ugh. I would not, but that's just me. And I got 2 of them. Love them, but man. And this just shows you that primary to secondary, to spermatid to sperm, oogonia, spermatogonia to primary to secondary. And there's those polar bodies. Okay. And again, they add something to the egg that makes it. And there's a bunch of fascinating research as to what it actually provides. So if you're interested, it'd be something to look up. When it comes to